Hey guys, today we take a step back into the muck-soaked streets of medieval Europe, not the world of glittering knights and shining tournaments, but the one behind the kitchens. Inside the market stalls, downwind from the slaughterhouse. We are talking about offal, yes, organs, guts, the bits you probably would not eat unless you lost a bet. But in the Middle Ages, these unglamorous parts were not just edible, they were treasured, traded, and turned into delicacies. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this gastronomic adventure with your appetite intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You trudge into the heart of a smoky, timber-framed town. The air smells like a mix of dung, wet wool, and stew that has been simmering for 3 days straight. It is market day, and among the stalls of turnips and barley, there is a crowd gathered around a woman ladling something from a large iron pot. You step closer, stomach growling, and she hands you a bundle. It is warm, slick, wrapped in something like parchment, but you realize it is not paper at all. It is animal stomach. Inside, chopped lungs, liver, maybe kidneys, all mixed with oats, herbs, blood, and fat. You are chewing before you can think too hard. It is greasy, savory, chewy in ways you are not sure you love, but you are not spitting it out either. That, my friend, is haggis, or at least its medieval cousin. You have just eaten your first offal dish. Medieval cuisine did not shy away from organs. Not because people were adventurous eaters, but because food was precious, and offal spoiled fast. If an animal was slaughtered, every part needed to be used immediately. That meant the liver might end up in a pie, while the intestines were cleaned, braided, and fried. Tongue, boiled and served with vinegar. Heart, stuffed with breadcrumbs and sage. You hear a man nearby bragging about a white pudding made of suet and sheep brains. His teeth are brown, but his pride is shining. There is no shame here in eating organs, only status in knowing how to prepare them well. And while you chew, another local quietly mentions the umbles from the deer a noble's men killed last week. He whispers because technically, those belong to the Lord. But some ended up in a pie at the tavern. That is right, the original humble pie was filled with deer guts, served to servants and staff. You can taste the irony. Historians still argue whether offal was considered strictly lower class, or simply a necessity turned tradition. What is clear is that the line between survival food and culinary pride was blurrier than a tavern mirror after a brawl. There are manuscripts that describe kidney stews in the same glowing terms as roast swan. And some recipes even recommend soaking spleen in milk overnight, an odd trick, but one that softens the bitter taste. Apparently. You notice the woman selling that stomach parcel is already out for the day. It is not just peasants buying. A cloaked traveler on a fine horse has a greasy napkin of his own. Maybe he knows something you do not yet. Maybe offal is not just what is left over. You wake the next morning in the corner of a one-room cottage, the hearth still warm. The smell hits you first, smoke, sweat, and something bubbling in a pot that smells exactly like boiled feet. Because it is. A woman crouches near the flames, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon worn thin from years of scraping bones. She is the cook here, but not the kind with neat aprons and cookbooks. This is survival cuisine. Equal parts instinct, luck, and pure refusal to waste anything. Today's recipe, trotter jelly. That is right, boiled pig feet, seasoned with vinegar, garlic, and whatever herbs happen to grow in the backyard this spring. Once it cools, it sets into a shiny, jiggling mass that somehow counts as dinner. You wince. But she sees your face and smirks. Better than starving, she says, slicing a slab and handing it to you on dark bread. Welcome to the medieval peasant kitchen, where nothing goes to waste. The idea of throwing out organs, bones, or blood would be absurd. She shows you her pantry. Dried pig ears, salted sheep tongue, a flask of rendered kidney fat used for both cooking and, apparently, treating cracked heels. Liver is seared and mashed with onions and ale. Tripe, the cow's stomach lining, is boiled until tender and then tossed with sharp herbs to kill the smell. Even the bladder gets repurposed to hold cheese curds. It is inventive, frugal, and borderline brilliant. Mainstream historians agree that medieval peasants rarely ate actual meat. They could not afford it. But offal, that was accessible. Animals were not butchered every day, but when they were, the good cuts went to the Lord, the church, or the market. What remained, the heart, lungs, tongue, kidneys, got passed to the people, steaming and fresh, but with no shelf life. So they moved fast. Brains were scrambled with eggs. Blood was saved for pudding. If you have heard of black pudding, this is its ancestor: oats, onions, and blood poured into cleaned intestines and boiled until firm. You try a slice. It is spiced, earthy, and not awful. Curiously, many dishes developed clever methods to mask the less than pleasant flavors. Mustard, vinegar, and heavy herbs were constant companions to organs. And slow cooking was practically religion. The cook tells you that if you simmer tripe long enough, it starts tasting like meat, which is a comforting lie but one she seems to believe. Fringe accounts tell of mock roasts, offal reshaped to look like real meat. A stuffed bladder mimicking a ham. A liver ball coated in breadcrumbs pretending to be roast duck. It is part performance, part comfort. And yet, historians still debate whether this was culinary creativity or simply desperation in disguise. Did peasants take pride in these meals? Or were they simply doing what they had to? It is hard to know for sure. Recipes were not often written down in peasant homes, but passed by hand, by firelight, generation to generation. As you watch her deftly slice boiled heart into thin coins for drying, you start to understand, this is not just food. It is resourcefulness made edible. A survival tactic. A kind of devotion. And lunch. The manor doors creak open, and you step into a world that smells of beeswax polish, roasted fowl, and something faintly metallic, like blood, only more expensive. You are not here by accident. You have somehow scored a place among the lower guests at a noble's feast. You expect roast venison, maybe swan stuffed with almonds. But what arrives first stuns you. A delicate pâté, glistening under a sheen of clarified butter, is presented in a crust shaped like a rose. It is liver. Not just any liver, but the finely ground, wine-soaked, spice-laced kind. You hesitate, remembering the peasant's liver mash from the day before. This is not that. Turns out, the nobles eat offal too. They just do it with flair. Across the table, the steward slices into a roulade of stuffed tripe. Cow's stomach cleaned to pristine white, filled with minced sweetbreads and egg yolk, spiced with saffron and ginger. It is served on a silver platter with an herbal sauce that would make a modern chef weep with envy. You glance at the others. They do not flinch. Some even nod in quiet approval. This is high cuisine. Offal is not just for the desperate. In fact, Wealthy kitchens often used organs to showcase culinary skill. A good cook could transform a kidney into a delicacy or make pig's brain taste like pudding. These feats were not born of scarcity, but artistry. There are records of royal banquets featuring whole roasted tongues, beef, swan, even porpoise, which technically counted as fish for fasting days. At one infamous feast, the entrails of deer were flavored with cinnamon and wrapped in dough, served with a pepper sauce. It is grotesque. It is gorgeous. And yes, it was probably delicious. One 14th century recipe book, The Fermi of Curry, includes elaborate dishes using everything from pig spleen to goat testicles. Historians still argue whether these cookbooks reflected daily meals or merely fantasy menus. But there is no denying the detail. You do not waste ink on spleen soufflé unless someone's genuinely ordering it. It is the presentation that sets it apart. The same ingredients eaten by peasants appear here, but sieved, sauced, and set into elaborate forms. Offal becomes a showpiece, an edible status symbol. But there is also a sneaky hypocrisy. Nobles would wax poetic about delicate goose liver pâtés while looking down on peasants boiling pig guts. It is the same dish, but class changes the taste, apparently. You overhear a knight grumble about lower sorts eating lord's leftovers. But when a servant quietly offers him a honey-glazed calf's brain fritter, he accepts without blinking. Fringe accounts suggest some nobles had secret tastes for more rustic offal. A few even kept personal cooks skilled in peasant recipes, only refined and renamed. A sheep's stomach pie might become pasta de metal, no translation offered, of course. And you find yourself reaching for seconds of something you can't quite identify. It is rich. It is earthy. It might be spleen. Suddenly, that haggis from the market does not seem so far off. It just lacked the silver platter. You are back in the village now, wandering past the apothecary's stall, a crooked table stacked with jars filled with everything from dried herbs to what looks suspiciously like preserved animal parts. You peer closer. Yep. That is a sheep's gallbladder floating in vinegar. The label reads, "For melancholy and toothache." Delicious. See, offal was not just food. It was medicine, magic, and sometimes, believe it or not, a love charm. A local healer approaches, hunched but sharp-eyed. She lifts a pouch tied at her belt and spills out dried slices of ox heart and thin strands of animal sinew. She tells you it is for brewing tea to restore courage. You laugh, until she mentions it was used by knights before battle. Something about drawing strength from the beast's center. Superstition soaked every part of medieval life, and organs were no exception. Cow lungs were boiled to treat coughs. Pig bile, mixed with wine, was thought to cure jaundice. You are pretty sure one concoction includes stewed lamb brains with sage to boost memory. Historians still argue whether these cures were symbolic, rooted in humoral theory, or just elaborate placebos, but they were absolutely taken seriously at the time. The church walked a careful line around these beliefs. You could use animal parts for healing, but not for sorcery. Still, people whispered. A pouch of dried rooster gizzard tied to a girl's bodice was said to secure her affections. Sheep's heart, pricked with cloves and roasted with the hair of your beloved, was believed to rekindle lost passion. Don't try this at home. Or anywhere. In some parts of Europe, eating specific organs was linked to absorbing virtues. The heart gave bravery. Liver gave wisdom. Tongue gave eloquence. Yes, really. There were even accounts of monks subtly adjusting their diets based on which virtue they wished to cultivate. One chronicler notes a bishop who consumed veal hearts weekly. Coincidence, perhaps. Fringe beliefs took things further. In Germany, a witch's butter made from melted bone marrow was said to protect against possession. In parts of rural France, rubbing fresh sheep spleen on aching joints was a common remedy. Whether or not it worked, it certainly felt medieval. Meanwhile, children were sometimes fed boiled pig brains to make them less hot-headed. One village even believed the bladder of a fox, dried and powdered, could cure nightmares. You watch a mother sprinkle something into her child's milk. She gives you a look. "It is just dear kidney," she says, as if that explains everything. Of course, some of this bled into cuisine. Ritual and recipe blurred. That stew might be hearty, but it is also good for the blood. That pie is not just tasty, it will keep the bile flowing right. You chew a slice of some grayish meat and wonder, dinner or diagnosis. Historians today still puzzle over how much belief influenced diet, or vice versa. Was it flavor, folklore, or fear that kept people eating guts and glands? Likely, all three. As you walk away from the apothecary, past someone selling charred bits of lung on a stick, you realize something. In the Middle Ages, to eat offal was not just to feed the body, it was to guard the soul. The butcher's shop is more of a wooden shed, but inside, it feels like a temple. Hooks hang from beams. The floor is slick with straw and something darker. A man in a leather apron, arms like tree trunks, carefully draws a curved blade down a pig's belly, working not with haste, but reverence. You watch closely. Every movement has purpose. The kidneys are tugged free and laid on a cloth. The liver, smooth and gleaming, is set aside with a nod. This is not random hacking. It is ritual. In the medieval world, butchering was a licensed, tightly regulated art. Towns had guilds for it. You could not just set up shop and start chopping, you needed training, permission, and sometimes even church blessing. Mistreat the meat, and you were not just breaking rules. You were violating order. The rules were not just about hygiene though. Yes, even back then people understood rot was dangerous. They were about hierarchy. Certain organs went to the church, others to the Lord's table. Some butchers even operated under laws that banned selling specific guts without inspection. Break those, and you might find yourself flogged, or worse, banned from selling entirely. And if you were Jewish or Muslim in medieval Europe, your laws were stricter still. Kosher and halal slaughter required precision and reverence. The removal of certain fats or nerves, the immediate draining of blood, every step mattered. Historians note that these religious rules created entire secondary markets for offal, as parts forbidden in one context became precious in another. Meanwhile, in Christian towns, public butchering was often scheduled to keep the streets from flooding with gore. You might see pig heads stacked like pumpkins, or sheep lungs sold in buckets by boys who could not yet afford knives. A fringe record from a town in Bohemia describes a day called Organs Day, when excess offal was boiled communally, and yes, it smelled just as awful as you imagine. Still, tastes evolved. In later centuries, laws were passed to limit offal consumption in wealthier homes. Not because of health, but because too much demand was driving up prices for the poor. Imagine being told you were too fancy for spleen. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine scarcity or moral posturing. Either way, it shows offal had climbed the ladder, from scraps to status. And yet, it is here, in this humble butcher's stall, that it all makes sense. The careful cuts. The reverent sorting, the boy outside turning sheep intestines into sausage casings. This is not just about food. It is about tradition, economy, even dignity. You buy a skewer of something spongy and lightly charred. The butcher winks. Lung, he says. From a beast that ran free. You chew. It is chewy, earthy, faintly metallic. And strangely comforting. As you walk away, past the tavern where someone sings about tongue and tail, past the stable where even dogs gnaw on hooves, you realize something. Offal was not a last resort. It was the fabric of everyday life, stitched together with blood, salt, and necessity. And somehow, despite the guts, it does not feel gross anymore. It feels real. As the twilight deepens, and the smell of ash and meat settles into your cloak, you realize that life in the medieval world was stitched together by more than war, kings, and castles. It was lived daily in kitchens and butcher stalls, in boiling pots and trembling jellies, in foods that both nourished and protected. So tonight, let your stomach settle, your breath slow. Rest easy. You have tasted the heart of history, gristly, chewy, and deeply human.